Alright, for today's critical thought, we're going to be discussing feedback loops in video games. And this is not the same as your core gameplay loop that we talked about in a previous topic. But when we talk about feedback loops, the most popular terminology is the positive feedback loop. And what that means is the player is doing something or performing a task, which in turn allows them to do that task again easier or grow more powerful at what they're doing. And the positive feedback loop is an essential part of understanding progression as well as the allure of playing these games. And typically the positive feedback loop is seen in RPG or abstracted based titles, where you can get that sense of scale and growth over how many minutes, hours, or days you're going to be playing a game. And one of the best examples, and one that we've talked about previously, is the ARPG positive feedback loop. And what that is, of course, is you fight monsters to get more loot, to grow more powerful, to fight more monsters, to get more loot, and we just keep going around and around. I hope you enjoy my little circle there. But the point is, the player performs a task, which is fight monsters, and by doing so, they're going to become more effective at doing that by getting the loot and experience they need to power up, and then they repeat it again and again and again. And the positive feedback loop is an essential part of trying to nail down why someone's going to keep playing your game and the major form of progression when it comes to your title. And like I said a minute ago, you can see this even in strategy-based games. XCOM has its own positive feedback loop. You fight the aliens to gain the tech and resources you need to upgrade your base and squaddies to make them more effective at fighting aliens, and again, it's a circle that we can repeat. And while it sounds like a very simple concept, it's still very important to understand both its impact and the risks that can go along with it. And we're going to start, and there's actually several parts about this I want to touch on today. And we're going to talk about things from a optimization or min-max point of view. The thing about positive feedback loop in terms of its technical, or when we look at it from other industries, is that as it keeps growing, it will eventually become or reach a point of destability, or it will be unstable, I should say, there you go, and will basically get out of control. Now, what this means for playing a video game is that if there aren't limitations or caps in place to prevent the player from growing too powerful, the player can reach a point where they will just break the game. For instance, we can talk about stuff like Dissecting, wherein the entire game is about its positive feedback loop of growing their characters and gear ever so more powerful to the point that the main game doesn't even matter anymore. Now, when it comes to single-player titles, this isn't seen as being too much of a bad thing. And as a game developer, you have to also understand if someone figures out the best way of playing your game and creates that positive feedback loop that they're just breaking it, you have to take into consideration just what goes into that exact action. Is it something that anyone can repeat very easily? Or does it require a very complicated or advanced understanding of your game? Because that will determine whether or not you should leave it in. And there is an entire discussion waiting to be had about that. For instance, with Shadowhand, there are discussions regarding some of the game's late game items and how they can lead to that snowball impact of the positive feedback loop. Because again, when it comes to this, the more the player uses it, or the more it gets pulled in, the more effective it becomes. And if you're not careful, you can create a game-breaking situation. But if it's something that requires skill or pre-planning, then that could be a different story. And for any developers watching this, I'm curious, have you ran into examples of a positive feedback loop getting out of control in your game, be it single or multiplayer, and what did you do, if anything, to try and temper it? Now, when it comes to the risks of a positive feedback loop, or feedback loops in general, we see this mainly in multiplayer, or more specifically, competitive game bounce. And this is where things get very tricky. Because, like I said, the point of the positive feedback loop is that as we keep doing it again and again and again, the player's just going to keep growing exponentially more powerful. Now, while that's not too bad when you're dealing with AI, it becomes a different matter when you're dealing with another player. Because, as anyone will tell you, at the end of a competitive match, there's a winner and there's a loser. And one of the hardest or more challenging aspects of this design is making it so that the loser doesn't feel like taking their monitor and throwing it out the window or taking a hammer to their game console. And one of the biggest risks of feedback loops, especially in competitive games, is the snowball effect, wherein if I start winning, it becomes easier for me to keep winning. Or conversely, if I start losing, there's not much I can do to correct that downward spiral. And keep that in the back of your mind because we'll be talking about the downward spiral effect again in a few minutes. But multiplayer-based games, especially those that are built on a power growth over play or taking territory or something that involves a persistent growth from beginning to end of the match to see who wins, this can lead to a snowball effect if you're not careful. A really good example of this is from the MOBA market. Stuff like Heroes of the Storm, League of Legends, Dota, and stuff like that. Wherein, once a team starts winning and they start collecting the gold and experience, it becomes easier for them to keep winning. Because if I'm a level 10 champion and you're a level 5, well, you're not going to be able to do much to me no matter how well your skill is. Or on the other hand, if someone on your team starts feeding the other team, like I've done many times, then that team will start getting an advantage that can allow them to pull ahead. And in most cases, once that snowball effect begins to happen, or that positive feedback loop, there's not much for the other team to do. And you can also see this in titles where I'm trying to do something, or once I start winning, I'm taking resources from you. And the strategy genre is a really good example. If you've ever watched like StarCraft or RTS competitive matches, you know that a very big stat is resources loss. Because if we just had we just fought a really big battle, and I only lost 2,000 units worth of resources, but you lost 10,000, I am not only 8,000 units ahead of you, but there's also the amount of time that's going to take for you to rebuild that army. So that if I attack again, it's going to be easier for me and harder for you. And we'll repeat this again and again and again until most likely I will win. Now, with that said though, competitive players will point out that there's always the chance for the underdog victory, or, that out of left field surprise win. And those plays can be very exciting in competitive matches, but they are few and far between. It's why, like Evo's highlight reel is in, 10,000 at this point. Although I'm actually not sure what the number is, if anyone knows that off the top of their head. And this is why for a lot of competitive-based games, people prefer that clean slate approach, wherein I beat you this match, and then everything gets reset to 0 for the next match. It's the same thing you see in football. When we get back, once someone's put down, once there's been a touchdown, again, you can see my extremely strong knowledge of football, but once a touchdown has been earned, the field gets reset for the opposing team to then kick off again. And that's a big point. It's making sure that there's always a baseline that both teams or both sides will return to, and that it creates an even playing field. The same thing you can see in smaller sports like tennis, wherein both sides of the field are obviously kept the same. And that it doesn't matter if I win 3 sets in tennis, that doesn't give me an advantage in set 4. And it's tricks or little things like this that help to prevent the positive feedback loop from taking control. Now, this is another reason why I think a lot of competitive players don't like persistent elements in their competitive games. Because, like I said, once you start winning, it becomes easier and easier for you to keep winning. And again, if you're playing a competitive game, it becomes very unfair for someone to say, join 10, 15 minutes in and realize that, oh, everyone is level 50, there's nothing more I can do. And you can see the same thing in what we talk about with the balance of CCG design and keeping that going for months or even years on end. It becomes exponentially harder for a brand new player to join a game like Hearthstone or Gwent or Magic or you name it, when you have a community and a competitive scene that has been playing and collecting cards for months or even years. And once you start getting those rare or legendary cards, it's easier for you to win. And if it's easier for you to win, it's easier for you to keep getting resources, which lets you buy more cards, which lets you win easier. And again, you can see the impact of this positive feedback loop. But with that said, though, before we wrap things up for today, I want to talk about the reverse of a positive feedback loop for video games or for playing a game. And interestingly, it's not called a negative feedback loop. In terms of the technical aspect, the negative feedback loop is basically the contrast of the positive feedback loop designed to rein it in. But from as far as my knowledge goes, we don't have an exact term for what we're going to talk about. I like to call it the downward spiral effect. But if there is a formal term for this, please let me know in the comments below. But like I said a few minutes ago, one of the major parts of the positive feedback loop is I gain resources or power that makes it easier for me to gain more resources and power. The downward spiral effect is the opposite, wherein once I start losing, it becomes easier for me to keep losing, and it becomes harder to correct that. And you see this very commonly in roguelike based design or even survival based games, wherein once I start losing resources or taking damage, it becomes harder for me to repair or harder for me to keep going. And roguelikes, again, are a really good point about this, wherein I start taking a lot of extra damage, I'm not able to recover that. So it becomes harder for me to level up because I'm fighting less. But because I am not leveling up, it means that the power disparity between myself and the enemy is growing in the enemy's favor, which means they're going to keep doing more damage, which means I can't get experience, and at some point I'm going to lose. And we've talked about this in a lot of games in the past. One of my, I guess, infamous examples would be, I think it was Dungeon of the Endless. I hope that's what it was called. That tower defense / roguelike game that came out a few years ago. And in this game, what happens is that in order for you to win, you need to be constantly leveling up your characters, getting higher up gear to power them up, and getting the material you need to upgrade your respective towers that are then placed down in each level. And I'm sorry, I just looked up, it's Ruin. Oh no, I'm sorry, not Ruin of the Reckless. Wow. I play way too many games with the word reckless in it. Oh, wait a minute, I think I've found it. Isn't it great when you look this up as an emergency? Here it is, Dungeon of the Endless. I was close, right? But in Dungeon of the Endless, what happens is the second you start falling behind, it becomes hard to catch up. Because if my characters aren't leveling up, it means they're not going to survive the enemy fights. Or it'll be harder for them to fight more and more waves. If they can't fight those waves, then I'm not getting the resources I need to power up my towers. And if I can't power up my towers, then my units can't survive. And we repeat this over and over again. And you'll see this very commonly in these kinds of games, where a lot has to go right, but very little has to go wrong. And you can say the same thing in something like FTL. Wherein if I am not consistently getting the resources and gear I need to survive, it becomes harder for me to keep going. Tharsis, that we've talked about many times over, is another big example. Wherein because the entire game is built on RNG, if I have a bad round, that carries over to the next round, which means it's going to be harder to correct that, which means I'm going to fall further behind. And we repeat this until I lose and there's not much I can do about it. And this is why for a lot of people who play these games, once you start falling behind, they will typically just restart the play. because it doesn't make sense to start that downward spiral and lose in 10 minutes if you know that's going to happen. And like I said, when this downward spiral happens, it becomes very hard due to the rules and design of the game to rise up or correct it. Very recently, another good example of this would be from the game They Are Billions. That is the tower defense slash zombie survival game. And this is a perfect example of that downward spiral. Because when a zombie, or infected as they're called, hits one of your buildings and knocks it off, the building becomes infected, which generates more zombies. But then let's say you have 5 buildings next to each other. So those zombies immediately attack the next building, which then attacks the next building, and so on. And then one zombie in the span of, let's say, 10 minutes, or I'm sorry, not 10 minutes, like 10 seconds, could become 20 or 30 zombies. And if you're not able to deal with it in time, you're going to lose a lot of resources, which those resources could have been used to get your defenses back up before the next wave hits. And again, you can see that it's a case where the winners keep on winning, but the losers just keep on losing. And this is a major part about the power of these feedback loops. So while the disadvantage of the positive feedback loop is that it can make it very hard to balance, the downward spiral can make it very frustrating to play. Because if I know that if X happens, I'm going to start losing, the second X happens, I'm done playing. Because I don't want to play a game for 20 to 30 minutes when I know I've already lost. Now, for those of you watching this, can you think of other examples of either a positive feedback loop or the downward spiral effect ruining your game? Like I said, with a positive feedback, it's either in a multiplayer setting where once someone wins, they just win the whole match, or in a single player setting that it just becomes boring or you just break the game. But the downward spiral is very tricky because there are games that are designed around the scarcity of resources and the fact that it becomes harder because that's the point. Stuff like the survival genre being a really good example. But let me know what you think below, and otherwise, thank you so much for watching today's Critical Thought. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. If you have a suggestion for a future topic, please let me know below. And have a great rest of the day, and I'll see you all next time. Until then, take care. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. If you'd like to suggest games for me to cover or topics to talk about, let me know in the comments below. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on design, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the Game Wisdom Patreon, you can find us on there on patreon.com/GWBycer. $1 will get you into our private Discord channel where we talk game topics and more. $5 will get you voting privileges for any major event, including the Saturday Night Grab Bag, Patreon-funded goals, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoy more videos here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel.